great. Thank you so much. Buonasera, good evening a tutti. I am Roberto Sgalla, the Director of the Center of American Study. I would like to welcome you all to our annual seminar on Musée history, literature, and culture. I would also like to thank all the speakers who will take part in such an important event for our center. The seminar of history, literature, and culture has been organized by the Center of the American Study in collaboration with the Italian Association for North American Studies, AISNA, and with the support the Embassy of the United States in Italy since 1953. The seminar is mainly, but is now inclusively targeted to Italian graduate students, PhD candidates, and recent PhDs. This year's topic draws inspiration from the centenary of the publication of T.S. Eliot's modernist masterpiece, The Wastelands, hence the title The American Wastelands, Environment, Resource, and International Challenge. I don't walk to talk at length, so thank you everyone who is with us today. I will hand the floor over to our guests, in particular to Rakesh Sarampundi, Cultural Affairs Office of the State University of American Embassy in Italy. Thank you, grazie a tutti, buon lavoro in questi 3 giorni e prende la parola? Prego. Rakesh Sarampundi.
Oh boy, I can finally take this thing off. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really, really good to be here today in person after more than 2 years of social distancing and only virtual events. My thanks to the director of the Centro Studi Americani, Dr. Scala, Sabrina Vellucci, seminar director, Professor Gigliola, Nocera, president of AISNA. Thank you for your hospitality and for welcoming us here for the 2022 Biennial Conference. I also want to extend my thanks quickly to our keynote speakers from the United States, Professor Julie Zay, Kathleen Brosnan, Gabrielle McIntyre, Italian keynote speakers, Professors Cristina Iuli, Carmen Gallo, and Angela Santese, and to all of you here, professors, young scholars, researchers, students, thank you for joining us today. As the program for this year's seminar demonstrates, the value of American studies as a discipline lies really within its cross-cutting nature, in how it draws from a wealth of knowledge and perspectives to help us understand the relationship between politics, economics, values, art, literature, and identity in America. And so our common goal is to expand the field of American studies in Italian universities, to give it a platform to grow and a standing in Italian higher education that will allow for increased professional interest in American history, politics, and culture. This is particularly important because today's students, many of you, are tomorrow's professionals in public service, in politics, in law, education, business, and the media. And I really believe that if we teach future leaders to think analytically and systematically about American structures and American institutions, about the representation of various cultural groups in American art, literature, and history, we really do help broaden understanding of America and of how America interacts with the rest of the world. And by doing so, we will have enabled a more fruitful transatlantic dialogue and a stronger US-Italy relationship. These exchanges of ideas are also a powerful way for people to see each other's humanity and to build a sense of common purpose around the values that we share. Study and exchange can change the minds of those who misunderstand us and tell the American story in a way that no policy or speech ever really could. The US mission to Italy, the embassy, has collaborated with ISNA since its founding, and ISNA has shown tireless commitment to promoting research and teaching of American studies in Italy, and to encouraging exchange and debate among American studies scholars here and internationally. Among the many projects that we've undertaken, I want to briefly mention one in particular, the American Studies Initiative, launched in 2016. And through this initiative, we've opened adjunct professorships in American history and American literature at several Italian universities. The number of students attending courses in US history and American literature is over 1,500. And the number of professorships, tenure track and non-tenure track positions for young scholars in the field of American studies has risen significantly. So we intend to continue our work in that direction. Together with the Centro, we're ISNA's partner for the advancement of American studies here in Italy. And let me close just quickly with a thought about cultural diplomacy, which is what I do. You know, Italian curiosity about US history and culture is as vibrant as ever. I returned recently from the opening of the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, a pavilion and exhibition by US artist Simone Lee that was, to my mind, a game changer. It tackled questions of history, tradition, identity, and people's experience in profound and provocative ways. In that same spirit, I hope we can all encourage Italian universities to support more courses in American studies and to promote the development of interdisciplinary research on US culture and history in a global context. We too, all of us here, can change the game. And in doing so, make the strong US-Italy relationship even stronger. This seminar and your presence here today is a positive step in that direction. Buon lavoro, and grazie a tutti.
Good afternoon, welcome everybody, and thank you, Mr. Surampudi. We will certainly follow your advice. We are here not only as ISNA, but also, let me say, as representatives of many Italian universities for enriching and for widening this wonderful initiative, which is the American Studies Initiative. So thank you for your continuous encouragement. I'm glad to be here as president of ISNA on behalf of all of our members and of the board. First of all, I want to thank the director of the Centro, Professor Roberto Sgalla of the Centro, who hosts us since many, many years. And I want to welcome all of you, professors, students, guests. I'm very happy to participate, to be part of these opening remarks for more than one reason. First of all, because every time I come here, I feel sort of at home, since as a student first, and then as a non-tenure scholar, and then as a scholar, I attended more than one seminar, actually many, many seminars, which at the beginning lasted, I remember very well, between 10 and 15 days. So more or less, they lasted 2 weeks. Over the years, of course, the seminars have become shorter in time, but never, I can assure you, never less intense. And this happened thanks to the wonderful organization of the center, Centro di Studi Americani, thanks to all of its organizers, above all, since quite a few years, thanks to Professor Sabrina Vellucci, who is the director of the seminar. And I want to thank in particular Dr. Sara Ammenti. Moreover, I'm happy to be here since this is the first seminar in presence after the pandemic. We have been discussing about this possibility both here at the center, at the Centro Studi Americani, and inside our board, because it was really a challenge. And it was a real challenge, but it has been a real success, since, as we can see, as you all, you yourselves are the living proof of the fact that it has been a success, because more than 40 students enrolled, and quite a few of you will receive a small grant, a fellowship from the Centro Studi, and also a contribution to both travel and lodging expenses from us as ISNA. Over the years, the seminar has always been ready to feel, to perceive, to listen to the latest views in the various fields of American literary criticism, US historiography, American culture in general. This year, in fact, as Mr. Suramputi was saying, this seminar, by the title of American Wastelands, plural, will reread the tragedy of World War I of Eliot's time and age from our contemporary stage. I mean, from our contemporary and global point of view. So we and you all, we together will discuss about literature, about history, about geopolitics, about ecology, and so on and so forth. So I want to conclude my few words by thanking you again. I believe that the seminar will be extremely fruitful. Thank to our guests, international guests, and thank to all of you students and participants. And I want to conclude by passing the floor to Professor Sabrina Vellucci, the seminar's director, and by thanking you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigliola, and thank you all. We are really excited indeed to be here again in person after 2.5 years. The last edition of the seminar, in-person edition, was in 2019. So it's been quite a long time, and we are really delighted to see so many of you and to have received so many responses from you. So there are a few people that I need to thank as well. First of all, of course, the Center for American Studies and the director, Roberto Sgalla, for the commitment and the efforts they make every year in organizing this event. Dr. Sara Ammenti, who is the seminar pillar, I would say, her dedication to the seminar is indeed an invaluable resource for us all. I also wish to thank the Center for American Studies Scientific Committee, Professor Daniele Fiorentino, Alice Ciulla, Giuliano Sant'Angeli Valenzani, Stefano Franceschini, and Anna Cadoni, who helped us putting together the program. I wish to give a heartfelt thank to the US Embassy Cultural Attaché, Rakesh Surampudi, and thank you for being here today. It means a lot for us. And thank to the US Embassy for the vital support that they offer to the initiatives of Italian Americanists. A heartfelt thanks also goes to Gigliola Nocera, ISNA president, for promoting and encouraging the association. And of course, thank you to all the board, the association's support to the seminar, and for providing an increasing number of scholarships and reimbursement for the students. The ISNA board, Cristina Iuli, who's here today, Anna De Biasio, Matteo Pretelli, Simone Francescato, and Lorenzo Costabuta. I also wish to thank all the colleagues that accepted our invitation and joined us from overseas, from the US, of course, and Canada, as well as from France, from the Netherlands, and also to the colleagues who joined us from other parts of Italy. And thanks, of course, again to you all for being here. I wish you all good work and a successful seminar. And I think I'm leaving the floor now to Gigliola for sharing our, thank you.
Introduce now to you, Professor Tsai. Okay. First of all, I would like to invite Professor Julie Tsai to come here. Okay, right. I'm sorry, okay. So let me introduce briefly Professor Tsai. Julie Tsai is Professor of American Studies at UC Davis. She has written 3 books, most recently Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, 2020, UC Press, edited Sustainability and Social Justice, 2018, NYU Press, and written over 60 articles and book chapters on environmental justice, the environmental humanities, geography, and public policy. She collaborates with environmental scientists, engineers, social scientists, and community-based organizers in California and New York. So let's welcome Professor Tsai. Thank you for, let's say, being here, although in remote. And please, I leave you the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It is 6 a.m. in California and on the West Coast, and I actually got the time zone incorrect, so I was here an hour ago. And so I'm very terrible with time zones. It is probably my US-centric, inability to understand global difference. I am very, very pleased to be here. It is an honor and a privilege. And I wanted to begin by thanking Professors Vellucci and Amenti. I was listening to the opening remarks. And so of course, I would love to be there in Rome, but one of the upsides of the, expansion of virtual is that we can have conversations in a more global way. So let me share my screen here with you all. My talk today, can you see everything correctly? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to, my talk is called Monsters in a Moment of Danger, and I will explain why I use that term. But I wanted to also say, in terms of the theme of American Wastelands, I was speaking this weekend with my colleague Tracy Voiles, who wrote a book called Wastelanding. And it is a book about how the US military mined uranium on Navajo lands. And she talks a lot about, wastelanding as a process. And she talks about it in relationship to environmental injustice, environmental racism, extraction of resources from indigenous lands. And we went back and forth when she was a graduate student and a postdoc about whether the book should be called Wastelands or Wastelanding. And she ended up choosing Wastelanding because she talks about it as a process. Wastelanding, the idea that some spaces are less valued, some lives are less valued than others, which is one of the fundamental issues and points around the environmental justice movements, which is where I have focused my research for 28 years. So I was thinking about this in terms of the theme of your conference. And what I'm going to be talking about today is climate justice and climate injustice and the US's special role, responsibility, and relationship to these issues. This is, me, and I have, I'm working on, there's a University of California Center for Climate Justice, which just opened up. And there are many videos around what this looks like. And obviously terms like climate justice, environmental justice, these are global terms that have resonance. But I will be speaking specifically from a US-centered standpoint and with a focus on Indigenous and African-American populations, in part because that's where my research is focused. That's where the social movements that call themselves environmental justice in the US, which have always been tied to these terms of environmental racism, come from. So I am both talking about climate justice today in a sort of broad sense, but where I really come from, just for total transparency, is focusing on social movements and focusing on the perspectives from African-American and Indigenous communities. That is, the work that I have done for a long time. So I use the term monsters because it comes up quite a bit. And of course, you are all in Italy, and so Gramsci, and you know it, of course, better than I do. But there, and perhaps this is a mistranslation, and that will be corrected, and that is totally fine. The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. I am also struck by this term monsters in terms of this James Baldwin quote: "People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction, and anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence long after that innocence is dead turns himself into a monster." And I've been thinking about these for a long time, since I told you I've been working on environmental justice since I was a student 28 years ago. And part of, I think, it's interesting, working on the same topic and working in social movements. It's a very different time now because more people understand these problems. There is more of a conversation about it. There's more of awareness of social injustice of all stripes, whether that's police brutality, what have you. It isn't like it was 28 years ago when a lot of the research was focused on empirical proof. Are these things real? Is there such a thing as environmental injustice? Is there racial disproportionality, et cetera? Now, I think we are in a moment where there is pretty much consensus that there are whatever you have it, environmental inequalities, carbon and climate change as a problem, COVID as a reality. And yet we're in a political moment that where in some countries, in some contexts, there are people like President Trump who, say these insane things that ignore empirical reality, and that is the monstrosity that we are in right now. We know what is happening with climate change. We understand what is happening with COVID. We are in a moment of monsters in that sense. But we are also in the moment, as Gramsci reminds us, where there is fierce struggle over what is happening. This is the moment that we are in where there is an opening for the old world and the ways that we did things to be changed and to be challenged. And so that is both the danger of the moment, the crossroads, but also the opportunity. That was an impromptu, not perhaps coherent thought, but I wanted to really, foreground why I use the term monsters. So the talk overview today is that I will be talking about what I call critical climate justice. And this is comes from David Pello's critical environmental justice, which is to say that there is a term like climate justice in the US, but also globally, is very, very common now. More people use it. But what does it mean? Any term that is broad, like climate justice or sustainability or environment, is both welcoming, it's compelling, but if it's so broad, it loses its sense of politics and its sense of meaning. And so what I want to really articulate clearly is that what I mean by climate justice is an analytic that links political and cultural struggles for decarbonization, decarceration, and demilitarization and dominance within abolitionist and decolonial frameworks to argue simply that climate justice is a freedom struggle. So what I'm going to argue is that as a freedom struggle, critical climate justice focus on negative and positive freedoms. And these ideas of negative freedoms, including, these are philosophical questions, freedoms from the legacies, historically and ongoing practices and realities of colonial extraction and racial capitalism, but also more positive freedoms. Positive freedom to love, regenerate, live, and practice community and solidarity. To live differently, to be in relation with others on many scales in a different way that we have done historically. So this paper or this talk introduces key documents from frontline climate justice alliances. I will introduce a lot of ideas that, of course, many of you are already familiar with, many of you can read more about, and the idea, for example, of just transition, which is in the idea of like, what does the transition look like from a carbon-based economy? And of course, in the description of the talk, which I didn't put in here, I said the US has been responsible for 25% of historical carbon emissions since 1750. By far the largest number. So I will say that again, and I have a slide for this. The US is responsible for 25% of historical carbon emissions since 1750. If you look from 1750 to 1882, it was the United Kingdom. And then from 1882, by far all charts, show that it is the US. So that is why, as American studies scholars, it is very, very important to think about climate, carbon, energy use, extraction, and also our sense of sort of global responsibilities and rights to each other. So the talk summary is basically that what I will talk about is how this idea of critical climate justice links different institutions, prisons, policing, and the military as hegemonic institutions that are tied to harmful practices, histories, and attitudes. And these are broad: domination over nature, fossil fuel extraction, and white supremacy. And what critical climate justice movements and their frameworks argue is that these institutions and ideologies have to be dismantled and remade. So I use the term frontline, and I just want to be explicit about what I mean. So within the climate justice movement within the US, which is a transnationally linked movement, there is this term frontline climate justice. And that is the idea that the people who are most impacted first and worst are people who are socially disempowered. That is often shaped by race and racism, indigenous extraction, but also factors of class, citizenship, and gender. And so this idea of frontline is, many of you are maybe familiar with the term canary in the mine. The canary is sent into the mine, and if it dies, then, it's no good for the miners. So that the people who are most impacted are often the least responsible. Of course, climate change and the impacts of it will impact everybody. But the question is, who is impacted first and worst? So to give you one example, the US has basically bombed the Marshall Islands left a toxic legacy there. The Marshall Islands in the Pacific are very vulnerable to sea level rise as well. And so, but the small island states in the Pacific, along with in the Caribbean or in the coastline of Alaska or in New Orleans, are the least responsible, yet they are the first impacted. Not the only, but the first. And so that is what the term frontline means. So frontline climate justice activists use a transnational framework to argue or to push against mainstream technologically driven conversations around climate policy. So the hegemonic ideology around climate justice, around climate policy as well, if we switch to electric or solar, then everything will be fine. And climate justice movements say, well, we don't just want a post-carbon version of the unjust world we live in now. So as such, critical climate justice is a theory of enchantment that moves from hierarchical and global white supremacist visions of carbon, military prisons and policing, and human hierarchy over nature that brings us into an emancipatory future. This last sentence is not as well developed. This is from a new book that I'm working on. So if we can talk about what I mean by this, where many of you are probably familiar, the theory of enchantment comes from Silvia Federici, but I have not developed this idea, as well. So this is where I'm sort of thinking right now. So today's questions I want to ask are, what is critical climate justice and why does it matter? And what does freedom look like in the face of environmental and state violence in climate change in its multiple forms? Military surveillance of borders, surveillance, militarization, policing across borders. So what I want to do in terms of outlining my talk is I want to talk about environmental racism and climate injustice as violence, talk briefly about my most recent book, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, which I wrote before COVID, but obviously, COVID exacerbates the moment of danger we live in, and think about critical climate justice as a freedom struggle, and give you some examples of what that looks like through the just transition framework and these ideas of abolitionist climate justice, and leave some time for Q&A. And also let myself have time to drive my child to school and walk my dog. So that is my aim today. So I want to talk about climate justice as injustice as violence in terms of disasters, impacts, and injustices. And of course, it is not just climate. If we look at many indicators, you will see 1950 as a key moment when things change for all kinds of reasons. And you can look at this, and this is the idea of the Great Acceleration, if you're not familiar with it. Carbon and climate change is just the most recent manifestation of an extractive politics that's based on domination of and over nature. So the US and the world is burning, flooding, and exploding. I am talking to you from California. Some of you might be aware that our wildfire season was horrendous in the last couple of years. It's not going to get better. The psychological and political impact of that, especially under COVID, was so horrific. Wildfires were so bad. You couldn't go outside and you couldn't go inside because of COVID. And so there was a feeling and a growing realization of sort of feeling trapped, feeling like there are things beyond your control, a sense of sort of imprisonment, which for many people was unfamiliar, but for people of color, for especially African Americans who have been hyper-policed in cities, for Native Americans on reservations, for working class people who do not have choices of how to live, of this kind of illusion of freedom. those are not unfamiliar, that is not an unfamiliar state of being. It is unfamiliar for middle-class people, for white people, for people who have historically have privileges to sort of come and go, as they please. But that idea of sort of feeling trapped by wildfires, floods, air quality, what have you, is both an empirical reality and a psychological affective shift that is important to understand. Authoritarianism politically is linked with racism, anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment, gender violence, militarism, and corporate capitalism. This idea that crises are interconnected, again, police and state-sanctioned violence, the politics of pandemic and public health, and climate disaster is more apparent to those around the world than ever before. And the social movements and youth movements protest vigorously against political fascists, against cultural nationalists, against political parties, and they protest against the economic, social, and racial inequalities that have been made worse under COVID. The climate crisis has come home in the shape of hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires, and the old political order is crumbling. What takes place now is under fierce struggle. The action is in the streets, it's in the classrooms, and it's in stories and narratives that are shaped both from all sides, government chambers, corporate boardrooms, but also youth movements and people on social media. Donald Trump, when he was president, came to California after the wildfires, and he basically, was the monster who spread nonsense and blamed Californians for not raking leaves for the wildfires, despite the fact that 57% of forests in California are under federal control. In a delusion that mixes weather and climate, he said it's getting cooler. Despite a president and millions of Americans, including the infrastructure of the Republican Party, facts matter, from COVID-19 to climate change. COVID-19 will not magically go away due to weather or drinking bleach, and climate disaster will not disappear because you wish it to be so. It seems horrific and depressing to need to say this, but acting as if facts and science do not exist will only make problems worse. Denial is a prison, it is a monstrosity, and we need freedom now. We are dying in a warming world that colonialism created, that industrial modernity made exponentially worse, which transnational corporations under neoliberalism are trying to finish off. But of course, we live in a rich and beautiful world made now more precarious under threats, environmental and otherwise. So climate justice, critical climate justice, I suggest, focuses with laser-like precision on issues of history, power, and knowledge in weighing in on these debates. So my arguments today simply echo those and interpret those made in the struggle for environmental justice and climate justice that prioritize the voices and perspectives of those most impacted and least responsible for environmental pollution and problems. Again, these frontline communities that are comprised and led by people of color, indigenous people, and the poor, what some are now calling the people of the global majority. Environmental justice activists insist, of course, for the last 30 years that the environment is where we live, work, play, and pray, and also are imprisoned. In other words, environment is not just sort of nature and wilderness. Environmental justice activists also articulated 30 years ago that we speak for ourselves. Environmental justice advocates frame environmental problems and their roots with racial, socioeconomic, and political inequalities in toxicity, pollution, and climate change. Climate justice movements reject climate change, its causes and responses, as divorced from history, politics, economic domination, and how these saturate and remake global social and racial inequalities. They reject environmental issues, whether that's air, water pollution, pesticides, toxicities, siting, and drought, as separate from each other or from domains of public health and land use, and divorced from the structure of political and economic life. To get to carbon, we all know these, the impacts have been well documented. We don't really, I think, need to spend a huge amount of time on it, but climate change is about flood, ocean acidification. It threatens, food systems. It's very much tied to the sort of global movements of people, displacement from hurricanes, deaths from heat waves, and so on. Another visualization of the impacts. This is from the British geographer, kind of talks about what it looks like if sort of we stay under 2 degrees, and then, if we do nothing, 5 degrees. We all know, I think there have been enough reports and climate science to that we're familiar with this. So what is the idea of injustice? The climate injustices. Again, impacts, disparities, and so on. So what frontline and environmental justice and climate justice activists, and I use these interchangeably because it's the same kind of movements, they say, and this is from one of the organizations, frontline community-based organizations have the solutions to the extractive industrial systems that are eroding humans' primary means of existence on the planet. Climate justice movements are anti-racist in their rejection of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. They are decolonial in that they center indigenous perspectives. They are feminist in orientation. They bend, but are not always necessarily anti-capitalist in their critique of marketization, consumerism, and they are pretty strongly critical of militarization on oil and gas cultures. Environmental justice movements and climate justice movements have long argued for making connections that exceed and defy binaries. For example, the ones between social and environmental issues. And also they begin to challenge the capitalist common sense. In a brutalizing era that is focused on endless death and the acceptance of death, whether that's COVID or climate change, justice movements contribute their stories, their histories, and their worldviews based on intersectional analyses that span historic time and geographic space. Simply put, environmental justice and climate justice are synergistic. They see things as connected. And the connections are also build upon each other and make things worse. So climate change and COVID and dovetailing with the sort of legacies and realities of extractivism make everything worse. I love this slide because it is such a sort of simple and effective visualization of climate injustice, which again, red in this case is bad, red is vulnerability, and you could see that the worst impacts of climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in India, and in the Pacific Islands, Latin America, and so on. The places that have historically not created the problems of climate change. This is also, of course, a political map, a historical map as well. And so, I want to just focus and make that very clear. Again, in terms of the US, what does environmental injustice, environmental racism, and climate change look like? Environmental justice is a question of distribution, whether there is a mismatch between, again, who causes problems and who is impacted. Environmental justice foregrounds these politics of looking at power at the core of the analysis of causes and solutions. And I put in a couple of pictures of movements that I talk about in my most recent book. The bottom is from Hurricane Katrina, which was in 2005. Many of you are probably too young to remember Hurricane Katrina, but for those of us who are a certain age, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans was this kind of wake-up call about the horrors of what sort of the state neglect of large populations look like, and also what sea level rise of a major city actually looks like. And then the other photo is of a website from Kivalina, which is in Alaska, which is an Inupiaq village, which is already being wiped away from climate change. There's about 400 of these indigenous small villages in Alaska that are being currently wiped away by climate change. So climate change, again, is not a sort of future thing. It is an already happening thing. Kivalina is not unique, but it is special because they sued 25 gas and oil companies for the harm that their extraction did. The lawsuit was thrown out of court because the Ninth Circuit said, you know, this is a sort of political issue. This isn't a sort of a juridical or legal question, which of course, you know, my point was that environmental and justice movements reject these sort of separations between, oh, this is legal, this is environmental, this is public health, this is historical, this is spatial. Justice movements see all of these as connected. And, you know, there's a sort of technocratic and a certain kind of way that sees these, that doesn't understand this kind of framework of everything being connected. Again, you know, these are some visualizations of what I talk about in my book around Hurricane Katrina. The center is from an amazing documentary, which if you have not watched on Hurricane Katrina is my absolute favorite. There's a lot of music in there as well. It's called Trouble the Water. And that is a picture of Colleen Swan, who is the Inupiaq leader in Kivalina. I'll skip this slide. So where I'm at right now is thinking about environmental justice in a moment of danger, which is my most recent book. So environmental justice in a moment of danger was written in, it came out 2 years ago, again, pre-COVID. It is a small book that talks about different environmental justice movements, many of which you are familiar with, the politics, the organizing, the direct actions around the Keystone Pipeline and Standing Rock. Many of you maybe are familiar with Flint, Michigan, and the lead poisoning that happened there. I talk a little bit about the Central Valley region of California where I am located, which is, you know, a farm worker, you know, if you know Cesar Chavez, you know, this California is the industrial agricultural breadbasket of the US. We are 2% of the farmland in the US, but use 25% of the pesticides. And so again, that question of disproportionality, you know, 2% of farmland, 25% of pesticides. And of course, you know, this heavy pesticide use does not land on people equally. That lands on farm worker bodies in particular ways. So the key questions of the book that I ask are, what crossroads and moment of danger are we in now? And what might we learn from environmental justice movements in our moment of danger? What, you know, I talk about is that we are both in a new and familiar crossroads and moment, but that what we can do is learn from environmental justice movements who have been fighting all of these different forces for a very long time. So the book is tries to link these different struggles and connect them with each other. And each book, each chapter has a sort of social movement, a keyword, and a organization. So chapter 1 talks about settler colonialism, extraction, indigeneity, and gender violence, and talks about the Indigenous Environmental Network. The second chapter talks about water racism and water justice. Again, the state-sanctioned lead poisoning of a majority Black city in Flint, Michigan. But I also connect it with the Central Valley through the framework of privatization and neoliberalism, and the anchor organization is the Community Water Center. And the last chapter talks about hurricanes, Katrina, Hurricanes Maria in Puerto Rico, the politics of climate justice. I try to talk about this idea of a non-naive radical hope, the kind of idea of disasters and the kind of apocalyptic moment that we feel like we're in, but trying to historicize it. and to talk about the politics of restorative environmental justice and reparative environmental justice. And the anchor organization there is Uprose in New York City. So what I argue in this book is that justice movements provide a soundtrack of freedom in a moment gone mad, in a global moment that seems addicted to death, destruction, and the acceptance of those as kind of normalized, which again, I would argue it makes, if we accept it, we are the monsters as well. What justice movements do is they argue against violence and for freedom capaciously defined. Environmental justice movements are freedom struggles. They are particularly significant now. They're intersectional movements, and they cross time and space. So environmental justice and climate justice movements reject the emotions of despair, as they always have. And their primary affective modes are resistance, survival, life affirmation against capital accumulation and endless economic growth, and solidarity that is based on radical empathy, humor, grace, and transformation. Again, this politics of a non-naive radical hope. It is not naive because it is grounded in lived experience, intergenerational trauma, and violence. It is radical because the politics refuse reformist politics, making unjust systems more tolerable, rejects the idea of tinkering or making these systems, like if there's more diversity, it'll be better. Like let's just make this, more women in an unjust, extractive politics. Like that's not justice, that's not freedom. And these politics are based on hope, resistance, and solidarity between communities and ecosystems that are made vulnerable and already primed to die because of these legacies of injustice, extraction, and violence. I am very influenced by this new book called Ugly Freedom by a political scientist named Libby Anker. And she talks about the appeals to freedom in contemporary US political thought, and how ideologies and practices of freedom legitimate other forms of oppression. And she writes, and this is a quote from Anker, stories about freedom, about people's imbrication in something called nature, and about political agency are important for climate politics. Any large-scale effort to halt global warming will depend upon telling different stories, reworking the stories underpinning destructive relationships to the planet, and reworking stories of freedom. In other words, how we tell stories of freedom matters. Some of you might be familiar with this book, and the politics of the Green New Deal. And this comes from Naomi Klein's introduction to A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Klein says that the environmental movement has suffered and continues to suffer from imaginative asphyxiation. So in contrast to the denuded generic climate justice frame, frontline climate justice posits a worldview and stories of freedom that are fundamentally different from those that exist in political, economic, and cultural systems that we now live in. Anker argues that, quote, if the freedom to participate and to help compose a world alongside others is premised on a subject that is not the masculinized, heroic individual who self-wills his action, but a collaborative amalgamation of acts from many non-human and human natures that form an agentic ecosystem, then different stories of freedom will emerge from that vision. She talks in the introduction about, like, again, the ideology of COVID, like freedom as being an individual, like I don't want to wear my mask. You know what I mean? Versus the freedom to sort of protect others and to live in community with each other, including with agents that are beyond our typical understanding of sort of like humans control everything. But in fact that, why COVID exists is a complicated relationship between human and non-human nature. And of course, connected to political and economic and global and technological and transportation infrastructures that bring diseases and across the globe in ways that have not been seen before historically. So where I'm at right now is thinking about climate justice, critical climate justice as a freedom struggle. And I want to give you some examples, but I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So the idea of thinking about environmental justice and climate justice as freedom movements, again, means engaging with history of violence, imaginaries, and visionary perspectives. And I use the idea in the book of environmental justice as a structure of feeling. Many of you in this audience, of course, know that that is from Raymond Williams' structure of feeling. So what I wanted to talk about, briefly again, is in the, this is a quote from the A Planet to Win. They argue that egalitarian policies prioritize public goals over private and corporate profits, and they target investments in poor, working class, and racialized communities, what they call a real, radical, and effective Green New Deal that focuses on inequality, as opposed to a sort of a faux Green New Deal. This includes things like tackling policy issues around jobs, a jobs guarantee, technology, including a homes guarantee, and dismantling fossil fuel companies and private utilities to have a politics of public power, which in the US is not how it's done generally. So a real, radical, and effective Green New Deal offer utopian visions of freedom for climate justice, grounded in freedom from fear, freedom from toil, freedom to move, and freedom to live. Again, this is the 25%, you can look at this. This is the Global Carbon Project. So I also wanted to say that the US military is a big part of this. The US military has 800 military bases around the world. By itself would be the 58th highest carbon emitter if it was its own country. Some argue that all wars are oil wars. All wars are resource wars. And the access, and we can see this in the Ukraine and Russia, are about the access to oil and the extractive resources for militarism. And the US military, which has the single largest carbon footprint of any entity on Earth. So environmental justice and climate justice movements matter. They matter not just for understanding and analyzing our moment of danger, but in fighting it. What environmental justice and critical climate justice movements do is to connect. They connect climate politics, toxicity, global white supremacy, and the rise of authoritarian populism in very concrete ways. And they are global, and again, connect what is happening in the US to right-leaning politics in Brazil, India, Hungary, etc. And there are many scholars who are working on linking these COVID, climate, and political authoritarianism. There's a great new book called Global Burning by Eve Darian-Smith, which talks about wildfires in Australia, the US, and Brazil, for instance. So COVID and climate change are co-produced crises which necessitate intersectional analyses of overlapping but also uneven conditions of great harm. Where justice movements matter is that they reject the naturalization of disproportionate harm, climate or otherwise, and they reject never-ending death and destruction. Whereas the dominant response politically is to sort of normalize what some call the shifting baselines of acceptable COVID rates or in degrees temperature warmed, justice movements connect seemingly acceptable set of facts like COVID deaths, land loss to sea level rise, and reject these as acceptable. There is a lot of examples of what climate justice movements do sort of culturally to create the soundtrack of freedom. I don't have time to share a lot with that, but I've written about that elsewhere. Climate justice movements envision and they act upon their non-naive radical hope to build and create based on foundations of art, love, creativity, restoration, political resistance, collaborative relationship, and also political satire and humor in the face of the calamitous global present that is built on the funeral pyres of colonialism and capitalism that is dependent intrinsically on stolen land and labor. Climate justice movements foreground their perspectives to argue that they must lead policy, practice, and worldviews into the just transition that is limited, but not only the post-carbon world. Their agenda of decarbonization is not just about carbon, but a wholly different vision of the world that is against oil, whiteness, and capitalism. So there's a lot of social movement principles, which you can refer to this. I'm happy to share my slides as well. I want to just briefly share the strategy framework for just transition, which comes from a radical collective based in the Bay Area. And what they do here is to talk about, basically the problems. So you can see the problems are the extractive economy, and the sort of solutions are the living regenerative economy. And what I like about this slide and the way they reframe just transition is many people think of just transition as merely about oil or technology. And if you look closely at their slide, I don't know if you can see this, but they are linking both the extraction politics, this is my cursor right here, extraction, dig, burn, and dump, and that is what they talk about, but they also link some of the problems as consumerism and a colonial mindset, in other words, ideology, enclosure of wealth and power, history, and militarism. And then on the right, they talk about sort of changing the politics towards understanding regeneration, caring sacredness in work relationships, governance and deep democracy, and ecological and social well-being. So environmental and justice, climate justice movements have created, again, many theoretical and movement-oriented principles that are very findable online. And if you're not familiar with, for example, the indigenous principles of just transition, I think that they're very powerful statements. There have also been groups like the Red Nation, which is indigenous collectives that talk about the Red Deal for climate justice, or the Movement for Black Lives, which many of you know as Black Lives Matter, argue for the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. And there are hundreds of groups that are networked through organizations and coalitions like the Climate Justice Alliance. So I think what social movements do and why they're important is that they define problems and solutions in particular ways. Critical climate justice links political struggles, again, for decarbonization, decarceration, and demilitarization, and rejection of domination over nature. In other words, decarceration, a world without prisons and policing; demilitarization, a world without war and violence; and domination, a world where nature is abused and extracted through and beyond carbon, are interlinked. A just world for frontline climate justice activists is a remade world that takes decolonial, feminist, and abolitionist perspectives as their base for climate struggle and political transformation to overturn these legacies of colonialism and anti-Blackness, labor exploitation, and the continuing abuse of nature, including women and women's bodies. So critical climate justice rejects the hierarchical and global white supremacist vision of carbon, military, prisons, and policing, and human hierarchy and domination of nature. And to do so, the movements bring us into emancipatory future as guests rather than hosts and dominators. Climate justice movements live in standing and continuing solidarity with freedom struggles in the contemporary moment and also historically in the past. So those that emerge specifically, again, from Black freedom struggles, indigenous and anti-colonial struggles, and feminist social movements. Anker says, freedom entails domination and non-domination, world making and world destruction, both challenges to and impositions of unjust authority. Critical climate justice offer, again, this vision of freedom that is in many ways utopian, against the dominant way of thinking of freedom as individual consumptive sovereignty, what you buy, or the freedom to conquer nature by consuming objects and desires, to bend the world to one's will by devouring resources however one chooses. So what we need instead are militant collective actions that are focused on rehabilitating ecosystems and decarbonizing the economy, grounded in non-sovereign solidarity and radical mutuality, and thinking about human and non-human relationship, including our relationship to the air, water, microbes, toxins, and other bodies. So again, these freedoms are negative freedoms and positive freedoms. And environmental justice and climate justice movements are already and historically have been vulnerable to environmental abuse, extraction, and violence. I talk a lot about the book, about why counter-hegemony matters. I don't want to talk about Gramsci in front of an Italian audience, and also because I'm running short on time. But I think counter-hegemony is important because we have to think about a new common sense. Hegemony and counter-hegemony matters because the ideas have to grow in the mind as a possibility of alternative futures. In other words, the task of imaginative freedom is central. Why climate nihilism is so dangerous. Climate cynicism, attachments to capitalist domination, fidelity to authoritarian populism as politically inevitable. What they do is to work together to defang political opposition to dominant structures of power and its attendant institutions. So climate justice is a call for world making as freedom. And so, these are just some examples of some sort of cultural movements, I think, that I have written about, which, I've written about in other papers that I think, show the kind of politics of an abolitionist and decolonial climate justice politics. This fantastic film called Sorry to Bother You, which is, I think, the strongest, sort of anti-capitalist film I have seen coming from the US. Probably in the last 10 years. There's an amazing web series called The North Pole, which is a short, very funny series that links gentrification and climate injustice. And you could find that very easily. It's called The North Pole. And these are other images of social movements from Standing Rock, which was a an indigenous movement that Standing Rock only sort of began from that perspective. And here are some more images of sort of culture making that talk about the politics of counter hegemonic ideas of climate justice. The 1491s is an all indigenous humor comedian group. Of course, 1491 is a reference to 1492, but they are pretty, one of the lead comedians is Dallas Goldtooth, who is an important indigenous climate justice organizer. So, I think the idea, again, that humor is really part of the climate justice movement is something that especially older activists have difficulty kind of wrapping their head around. But it is very clear that these kind of new narratives are being made as we speak. Critical climate justice, again, name their enemies pretty clearly. Oil and gas companies, neglectful policy structures around immigration, asylum, and climate refugees, and global white supremacy. They rally against capitalists, privatization proponents, real estate developers, gentrifiers, and racist cops, including border patrol and detention. And they imagine the world that they want to make, one that is feminist, anti-racist, and indigenous-led, that lives with and not in a hierarchical relationship to nature, animals, and ecosystems. Only by identifying the roots and relatedness of problems, again, fossil capitalism, war and militarization, policing and prisons, and hierarchy over nature, can the collective global we imagine a different post-carbon just planetary future. Again, environmental justice and climate justice movements have been fighting for a very long time. And that is what we can learn from them. Not that they win, actually, but that they fight and continue to fight in the face of state-sanctioned violence. They are creative, they imagine politics differently, and they are revolutionary. And so they are indebted to people like Grace Lee Boggs, who argued she was a Chinese immigrant in Detroit who was married to a Black radical named James Boggs. And she wrote that the genuine revolutionary task is to live now as we want to in the future society rather than waiting for it to be realized. So critical climate justice activism and policy development bend in radical directions. Again, abolitionist, anti-capitalist, decolonial, demilitarized, and feminist. What they try to do is to connect and reconnect with transformed political, economic, and cultural systems. And of course, these are not US specific. There are strong links between the politics of buen vivir in Latin America and other movements in the global South in Brazil, India, and Mexico. Critical climate justice is radical, not corporate. It's communal, not individualized, and it's feminist, not patriarchal. Environmental justice movements live and make links within the US and across borders to create cultures of solidarity that travel between places, groups, and time, past, present, and future. And it is in these intersections and interconnections that justice movements are made and remade. This framework and praxis matters now more than ever as a principled base from which to bracingly face our collective planetary future. Again, living in denial does not make the problem go away. It makes us monsters if we ignore the problem. And people in the US prefer to ignore our histories and our debts to each other and our relation to the rest of the world, thanks to our enduring nationalist parochialism. But the science is clear and the justice activists have been right. Again, James Baldwin wrote about monsters, but justice movements remind us in their placards, music, and stories against this logical monstrosity. In simple statements like people and planet over profits. We can also see this in 1938 when Langston Hughes, the African-American Harlem Renaissance poet, wrote his poem, Kids Who Die. And I just wanna sort of start to end with this poem. This is for the kids who die, black and white. For kids will die, certainly. The old and rich will live on for a while, as always, eating blood and gold, letting kids die. What Hughes, Baldwin, and climate justice activists remind us is that the old and the rich eat their blood, their gold, and their oil, while kids, Black, brown, and indigenous, die. This horror has to be recognized as a monstrosity. Environmental justice and climate justice is more than resistance to environmental racism and colonialism, as if that wasn't enough. But they are a set of concepts and living practice that cross, again, time, generation, and space. They are a counter-hegemonic philosophy of practice, a search for freedom beyond local communities fighting bad environmental and regulatory systems. It is not just about state-centered policy, incorporation, or reformism. Rather, what justice movements do is challenge the status quo, rather than bothering with tinkering with a system that is grounded historically in domination, racial terror, and colonialism. Their vision for environmental justice is not to eat more blood, gold, and oil, but instead making work, care, food, energy, and lives matter, not cheap, disposable, and dead. This is an old idea. It is not new. It is worth remembering our collective past as a set of practitioners interested in justice of all stripes. I want to end here with Benjamin Lay. Many of you know that the Quakers were ardent abolitionists globally. But how did the Quakers become abolitionists? They became abolitionists in large part because Benjamin Lay, who holds the world record for being thrown out of the largest number of Quaker congregations, 5. Lay knew, as many do, that performative disruption sways, even if not suddenly. His life is quite incredible. You should listen to a podcast about him. He was an Englishman who moved to the Caribbean, was horrified by slavery. He was a dwarf. He was a vegetarian. He would go to Quaker congregations and sort of like bring blood out, like that came from like sort of berries, and, you know, kind of call people out on the Quakers on their hypocrisy. You know, how could they love peace and justice and yet support slavery? So he moved, even though he was thought of as like a complete crank and nutter butter, you know, in his time. So what we are in now is where many of us are trying to become Benjamin Lay. And if we are not directly on the front lines, then what we need to do is to support these rebellions. The lessons of the environmental justice and critical climate justice movement are in the struggles of people and community made vulnerable to violence and whose continued survival is a direct challenge to the political and economic order that is heavily addicted to capitalism, carbon, and white supremacy. And the significance of these movements is to challenge the authorities of whiteness, extraction, and violence through diverse voices, media, and perspectives. Revolution means engaging with radical hope, the focus on praxis and social movements. And justice and solidarity are everywhere if you look at it. In other words, we need to move away from the death cult of whiteness, carbon addiction, and capitalism, and towards the politics of empathy that has been too far in short supply because of the political and economic and cultural systems that have structured our lives and our world. Colonialism and slavery left ongoing legacies of economic extraction that rendered violence normal, and justice movements reject this common sense in such abstraction. Now is the moment of monsters and those who seek to make their monstrosity logical. But what we have to do is reject the politics, the slow death, and the fast violence. Environmental justice and critical climate justice is about living and loving beyond the shadows and the numbers. It is about love and creation in a moment of monsters that fetishizes death and spurns care. It is about reclaiming the ethics of morality and widening the circle to respect land and home, and to acknowledge historical trauma and violence. And what we have to do now is to maximize our collective convergence towards this ethic of care in the spirit of political solidarity, and to bend the arc of justice and freedom from oil and all forms of extraction, hierarchy, and violence. The time is now, for if not now, when else? So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tse. Thank you for this wonderful talk, full of so many suggestions. You showed us, of course, that the concepts of justice and justice, climate change must more and more be seen from a global perspective. And moreover, that each of us has his or her own responsibilities in the field. So no one is innocent. No one is innocent. If I understood correct, the talk, your speech has been recorded, right? Okay, okay. So this is a great news. I know that by 4 p.m. we are supposed to have a round table. So I don't know if we can have 5 minutes for, in case, for 1 or 2 questions. Of course, if you agree with that, and if you agree in case to answer just 1 or 2 questions, let's see if our young audience has been hit. Or maybe all of them are traumatized. No one is saying a word. This is the other side of the coin, of course. So in case you have just a curiosity, don't be shy, of course. Let's see.
I hope you're not traumatized. This the talk is meant to be hopeful. And that is why, but that's why I talk about non-naive radical hope, because climate justice movements on the ground and youth justice movements are hopeful. And I think it's very much a politics of hope, but also understanding what the real problems are. Do you know what I mean? The real problem is not just like, oh, well, if we change to electric everything, then everything is fine.
Sure.
And so the hope is in the fight. Which is why I wanted to really focus on the movements themselves and sort of the cultures that they create around them. And so, and also to invite people, I just did a keynote on curriculum from the British Association of American Studies, where they talk about climate curriculum and how we talk about climate change in our work. And climate and energy, that's not something you've done before, can be kind of like, oh, it's too much, that is not my scholarship. But I think that if we think very broadly about energy, about relationships, then you can see extraction and those kinds of analytics everywhere, instead of just saying, oh, well, I don't do climate. Climate is not a part of the analysis that I do in my work, analytically or in terms of teaching. And I think that, as American Studies scholars, and that's why I really focus on the 25% of historical carbon emissions. You cannot talk about anything in the US without thinking about those politics and those numbers, and so that's everything. But you don't have to be a sort of technical expert about carbon and parts per million. What you have to think about is, like enslavement and, how these play out in terms of disposability. So I want to invite scholars who have not historically thought of their work as sort of climate or environmental to really think capaciously about those categories and how is their work connected to this, rather than climate scholars do this, I do this. So
Exactly. In fact, what I would like to tell all of you students who are mainly students of literature, I believe, of American literature, don't think to be far from these topics. And I will give you just one very humble example. Think in 19th century America, think of one of the first and main ecologists by the name of Henry David Thoreau. He was a poet, he was somebody whom almost nobody took care of while he was alive. But many of the so-called nature writers took example from him. And after his death, not by chance, the United States of America started, encircling vast territories. And so the Yellowstone Park was born. And after that, other parks were born. And now we have portions, thank God, little portions of the vast continent of North America, not built with, forests. I don't need to tell you what a park is, what a national park is. So even you as students of literature dealing with both 19th or 18th century literature or contemporary literature, history, and so on and so forth, can be part of this process of climate change and be, very attentive to these problems. So thank you again, Professor Tse. It was a pleasure to have you here, as I insist to say, in presence, because you have been here in presence just in front of us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Anybody can email me and I'm happy to share my slides. Thank you so much.
The round table is supposed to start. I don't know if somebody will chair the round table or, okay, fine. Fine, I thought you were chairing the other speeches and talks. Thank you, Christina. I leave you the floor. Sì, certo, io l'ho fatto, infatti mi precipito a rimetterlo.
Okay, so we can start with our round table. Thank you, Sarah. The title of our round table today is Environmental Poetics and Environmental History Today, Questions, Methodologies, and Expectations. And before saying anything else, let me introduce to you our speakers. You see on both sides of my figure, and they're both historians and literary translators and poets and literature scholars. So we have a group of speakers coming from different disciplines. And so we are here to expect fruitful interaction and conversation about some of the issues that you have already listened in the earlier presentation, but we'll take those issues and we'll try to move them in a different direction. So I'm going in alphabetical order. Oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Cristina Iudi, and I teach American literature at the Università del Piemonte Orientale, which is a small university in northwestern Italy. So I'm going in alphabetical order. The first speaker that I'm introducing is Professor Kathleen Brosnan, and she is a professor of history at the University of Oklahoma. Her research and teaching interests include the American West, the US and transnational environmental history, legal history, urban history, public history, and the history of activism. So many of the things that you have heard, some of those keywords that you've heard today will resonate also in the scholarly profiles of all our speakers. Professor Brosnan is the author of United Mountain and Plain, Cities, Law, and Environmental Change Along the Front Range. And also she has published numerous articles and book chapters on environmental and urban history. She edited the prize-winning Encyclopedia of American Environmental History in 2010, and she has co-edited 5 books. I'm not reading all the titles, I just mentioned, I picked 2 because they, again, point us in different directions. One is Energy Capitals, Global Influence and Local Impact of 2014. And the other one is the most recent, which is entitled The Greater Plains, Rethinking a Region's Environmental Histories, 2021. Professor Brosnan is also a public historian who is very active in public engagement projects. She works with the National Park Service, the Newberry Library, the American Library Association, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. I'd like to mention that among her many accomplishments, she also edited and directed an online exhibit entitled To Bear Fruit for Our Race, the history of African-American physicians in Houston. And the reason why I'm mentioning this specific accomplishment is that exhibit has been utilized by more than 300 middle and high schools. So as an educational project. Professor Brosnan is also a past president of the American Society for Environmental History. I'm moving now on my right-hand side, and I'm introducing you Professor Carmen Gallo, who is a junior researcher in English literature here in Rome at Sapienza University. Her research fields are early modern poetry and theater, the 18th century novel, T.S. Eliot, Samuel Beckett, the relationship between literature and religion, British contemporary theater, and the history of the 20th century Anglo-American criticism. Professor Gallo has edited and translated the new edition of The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, which I'm sure you have heard at some stage, at least in your formative path. That new translation was published in 2021 by Saggiatore. She also translated The Lives of Great Poisoners by Carrie Churchill and All Is True or Henry VIII by Shakespeare and Fletcher. Professor Gallo is a specialist of metaphysical poetry. She published several essays on Shakespeare, Marlowe, Donne, Herbert, Crashaw, Milton, Defoe, T.S. Eliot, and then Beckett, and so on. I just want to mention another book that she published in 2018 entitled L'altra natura, Eucaristia e poesia nel primo Seicento inglese, Another Nature, Eucharist and Poetry in Early 17th Century English Literature. It's an important book that won the Tempera Book Prize 2018, awarded by the Italian Association for Shakespearean and Early Modern Studies. Now I'm going again on my left-hand side, and I'm introducing Professor Gabrielle McIntyre, who is Professor of English Literature at Queen's University in Ontario, where she specializes in British and American literary modernisms, and in particular in poetry, poetics, psychoanalytic criticism, eco-criticism, and theories of history, memory, desire, and the sacred. So we have a lot of connection here on my sides, on my left and right hand side. Professor McIntyre is author of Modernism, Memory and Desire, T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf, published by Cambridge UP in 2008. And she's also the editor of the Cambridge Companion to the Wasteland, published again by Cambridge UP in 2015. Professor McIntyre is also a creative writer whose poetry has appeared in international journal and book collections, including the Literary Review of Canada, the A-Line, Van Gogh's Ear, the Cortland Review, Free Fall, and Audeamus. Her poetry book, Unbound, was published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2021. Professor McIntyre has also been the recipient of several research grants and awards of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And also she has received two very important awards for teaching. The first one was the W.G. Bay Barnes Award for Distinguished Teaching at Queen's University. And the second one was the Clark Award for Distinguished Teaching at Cornell University. Now, I'm going again on the right-hand side, and I'm introducing you to our Angela Santese, who is a John Professor of U.S. Foreign Policy since 1945 at the University of Bologna. Professor Santese earned her PhD in Contemporary History from the Department of Political Science in Bologna. In 2012, she was Junior Visiting Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Washington, D.C. She won the Cisco Prize awarded by the Italian Society for the Study of Contemporary History for the best 2016 research monograph. In 2017, she won the postgraduate Vibeke Sorensen grant from the Historical Archives of the European Union. Her research interests deal primarily with U.S. foreign policy, Cold War history, and the history of anti-nuclear and environmental movements. She is author of La Pace Atomica, Ronald Reagan e il Movimento Antinucleare, 1979-1987, Ronald Reagan, the Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign and the Nuclear Scare of the 1980s, and also of environmental pacifism and the Cold War, the new anti-nuclearism in American historiography. I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to welcome all our speakers with an applause. And then I would like just to touch base really briefly on this really large, broad area of that is called the environmental humanities. And to go back to our title, because it was deliberately left very broad and open in order to invite our speakers to engage with some of the questions that the environmental humanities broadly conceived that have raised for them. As you probably know, this area of studies aims at engaging critically the relations between our knowledge of specific cultural, historical, and natural, if you allow me to put it in quotation marks, phenomena, and our knowledge of the broadly conceived horizon we call the environment or web of life or ecology. We keep it large because, of course, depending on the disciplinary field from which you come from, you probably have incurred in terms such as eco-criticism, ecofeminism, deep ecology, environmental history, critical environmental studies, environmental justice in the talk that we just heard, and all other series of studies investigating the relations between humans and the natural world in literature, history, postcolonial studies, critical race studies, social studies, and economics. Most of these fields address how individuals in society behave and react in relation to the environment. And this form of criticism has raised significant attention during recent years, of course, due also to the high social emphasis on the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, and also on environmental destruction and increased technology. It has opened new and fresh ways of analyzing and interpreting literary text, thus bringing up new dimensions to the field of literary, historical, and theoretical studies. But it also prompts the questions for our literary speakers today of, for instance, for the literary scholars, what makes a kind of poetry and environmental poetics, okay? And also for the historians today, how is their research on and their writing of history affected methodologically, hermeneutically, politically by the agenda of the environmental humanities? So without much ado now, I'm going to shut up and to invite the first of our conversants and speakers, Professor Kathleen Ralston. It should be, otherwise I can just pass along this.
Hello. Thank you. I wanted to thank the organizers and all of you who are in attendance today. Before I speak directly to what environmental historians do, I thought I'd do something slightly more basic and get us to think a little bit about what it is historians do. What do historians do? And I'm borrowing from my friends Thomas Andrew and Flannery Burke, who wrote a lovely piece that helps us explain this to undergraduates. I call it the 5 C's of history. Historians simply study change over time. Change over time. We put this change in context. So those are 2 C's. We study the causes of that change. So we study causality. We also look for complexity in the past. So in examining the causes of past events, we assume they are multifaceted, that there is not some singular explanation that takes us from point A to point B. And finally, and perhaps most difficultly, we talk about contingency. Contingency, when we look in the past, means we don't assume that events were inevitable. The human societies were on a progressive pattern moving towards some change. We assume that what happened in the past was contingent upon human choices in part. So the 5 C's for historians are change over time, context, causality, complexity, and contingency. And that last one, let me give you an example that might help. There was a popular ideology in the 19th century in the United States called manifest destiny. This notion that somehow white Americans were destined to take control over the large parts of the North American continent, create a new nation somehow grounded in their concepts of democracy and freedom, and build a great nation. But manifest destiny, what didn't exist, right? It was the matter of choices by people influenced by that ideology. It was contingent upon the choices they made. So where then does environmental history come in? As a field, we emerged really in response to the activism of the 1960s and 1970s. Like many of the changes across the academy, there was an effort to change things in response to new ideas about how we worked as humans, how we interact with each other in society, but also how we interact with the environment. So we certainly see changes in the academy, the development of women's studies programs, African American studies programs. Well, environmental history comes out of that same impulse. Now, we can find earlier intellectual antecedents, for example, the Annales School, the work of some geographers like Carl Sauer and others. But I think we can see that that disciplinary start in the 70s. It is a field that's been interdisciplinary from the beginning. Environmental historians don't simply say it's good, we embrace interdisciplinarity. We integrate historical narratives with studies from geology and hydrology. In my case, I'm now working on a book on the Napa Valley wine industry, so I study viticulture and enology. Okay? My first book on Denver, I had to understand mining, and I had to understand smelting. Okay? We embrace these things, we embrace the hard sciences, we try to find ways for the humanities and sciences to speak across disciplinary boundaries. We certainly are a field that's been influenced by activism. Not surprisingly, many of the earliest studies focused on wilderness. Wilderness protection was a large part of 1960s activism. Early scholarship focused on water pollution, air pollution, different efforts, all motivated by different activisms of the 1960s and 70s. But I think increasingly since the 1990s, environmental historians have embraced environmental justice as a paradigm to shape their scholarship. In the opinion of some, including myself, we haven't done it quickly enough or as thoroughly as we should. But environmental justice, not only looking at how the human relationship with nature has changed, but who has borne the burdens of those changes. And I realized in going through my handwritten notes that are hard to read, that I skipped over a definition of the field. So environmental history seeks to understand the complex entanglements of humans and the rest of nature over time. Complex entanglements of humans and the rest of nature over time. By doing so, we aim to broaden the debate about the desirability, the possibilities, and the prospects of enhancing sustainability and reducing environmental and social injustices. So we want to understand the human, non-human nature relationship and to broaden the prospects about how we can enhance sustainability and reduce social and environmental injustice. So then what's our larger role in the world of environmental humanities? What's our larger role in the world of environmental studies? To me, the real question is, what is environmental history's role in addressing the multiple ecological crises around the globe? If we're going to ask what environmental studies must do, well, that's it, right? If environmental history is part of environmental studies, we must be part of answering these larger questions about the contemporary ecological crises, many of which Dr. Say so eloquently laid out for us today. So how does studying the past speak to the future? How does studying the past speak to the future? Well, I think, again, we can go to those 5 C's: change over time, context, causality, complexity, contingency, and discover that in talking about the past, what we can do as environmental historians is offer parables, lessons about the past, which will hopefully complicate contemporary policy decisions. lessons that will inform policymakers about the potential consequences of their actions. So in thinking about this, I thought about the theme for this conference, wastelands. And I'm cutting it a little bit short to right now talk about waste. Waste has always been part of life. Waste has always been part of life. Living organisms produce waste. They always have. As environmental historians, we can look at how the dynamic of producing waste has changed over time. How certain large-scale events, urbanization, industrialization, consumerism, even digitalization, have produced new forms of waste, new quantities of waste, new textures is the wrong word, but new kinds of waste, right? Waste that didn't exist before, particularly when we think about the petrochemical industries of the 20th century. We also can look over time and with variation at how the burdens of waste have been distributed. Julie Sayes mentioned Wastelanding, a book by Tracy Voiles. She knows Tracy from Tracy's postdoc at UC Davis. Tracy is now my colleague at the University of Oklahoma, and you'll hear me talk about Tracy's book tomorrow. I even have a slide of the book cover. This idea of wastelanding, the idea that certain communities and certain locations are pollutable, can easily be subjected to the burdens of waste produced by any given society. Certainly this is true over time. That some communities, usually marginalized or racialized communities, have borne undue burdens of waste in their occupations, that they have been limited in their occupational choices to jobs involved in cleaning up others' waste, industrial waste. In the locations in which they often are living, in part because the locations in which they live have been limited, be it, for example, in the United States by real estate policies called redlining. These emerged in the 1930s as a result of federal housing policies that specifically identified African-American communities as being inferior and therefore not as appropriately suited for insurance or for high real estate values. Let me give you a really good example of this, not of redlining, but of a different way of thinking about waste and how the burdens are distributed unevenly. In the city of St. Louis, in the late 19th century, the city began a project to install sewer lines across the city to really put in a modern sanitation system. How to pay for that? How do you pay for that? Well, the city policymakers concluded that in the upper class, overwhelmingly white neighborhoods, those neighborhoods were damaged by the process of putting in sewers. Those neighborhoods were already healthy, had a high real estate value. And so the people in those neighborhoods actually did not have to pay any fees for having sewer lines put in, having their homes connected to the larger system. The same policymakers concluded that poorer neighborhoods, disproportionately occupied by African Americans and immigrants, would only be improved by the presence of sewer lines. And so the poorer people in the community actually had to pay fees to be connected to sewage lines, and the richer people did not. It is a systematic expression of wastelanding, of imposing these unfair burdens. So I think by revealing these complex policy choices in the past, by showing in part how they became institutionalized, integrated into systems of law and governance, and therefore still have implications today. still have profound implications today. Historians can really aid contemporary political debates. I think the other way in which we can really aid these debates is by talking about contingencies. Dr. Say brought up debates about climate change. And one of the, when we put out our book, Energy Capitals, we would, and I had this debate with my co-editors, and one of my colleagues would say, the logic of the market will dictate a reliance on fossil fuels until other forms of energy show their market viability. And he's an economic historian, and I would say, yes, Joe, but you are essentializing the market. You are acting as if the market is somehow a creature of nature, rather than a compilation of the choices made by humans. The market does not exist without human choice. It is contingent, and thus we can make changes. The last thing I wanted to mention, and this may be speaking to the cynic in me, is the challenges about how we do this kind of work in a university setting. You know, historically, universities have been very opposed to interdisciplinary scholarship. We work in our academic silos, in our own buildings. There are turf battles, right? It's the Jets and the Sharks. There are turf battles over limited resources. Even as interdisciplinary scholarship has become more prevalent, I can see within my own history department resistance to rewarding it. Part of this is grounded in jealousy. Some people's work is more amenable to interdisciplinary scholarship than other people's. And if you're going to start rewarding that work, am I going to be left out? So jealousy is part of that. Sometimes it's fear of relevancy with scholars. If we make this shift to rewarding interdisciplinary work and my work doesn't have them, am I relevant anymore? Am I left behind? I think we also, this type of work, our ability to engage in this type of work, and in particular to move beyond the academy, is also handicapped by a skewed reward system in the universities. In the hard sciences, for example, more emphasis is given to the amount of grant money a scholar brings in than to the quality of the work the scholar produces. The assumption somehow being that money equals quality. And that does not mean they're not doing good work, but those two things are not intrinsically the same. In history departments and humanity departments, there is great resistance to any type of reward in merit or promotion for anything that doesn't follow a traditional path. In history, that traditional path is producing a monographic study, right? And you know, I've written mine, and they're fun, but they aren't interdisciplinary. We aren't engaging with others. Also, we're at a time, at least at my university, and I think this is true at many, where we are it is increasingly demanded that we engage the community in our scholarship. But again, what are the rewards for that? They seem to not be coming. I think there's two challenges when we engage the larger community. The first is a challenge for us. We are very puffed up with our university educations and all our expertise. And perhaps the single greatest challenge for us when we meet with people in the community is to not talk. It's to listen. Instead of being so quick to share what we have to offer, we need to remember to learn from the people with whom we work, because they have much to offer us, if not more. I also live, unlike Dr. Say, who lives in California, I live in a very conservative state. Some might say reactionary. I live in a state where conservative legislatures are threatening tenure. I live in a state which recently passed legislation to supposedly protect freedom of speech in the classroom, but is really designed to police professors. I live in a state that passed legislation last year limiting how we teach issues of race. Now, granted, its bigger impacts were for younger students, K through 12 education in the United States, but we are certainly concerned about its implications in our university classroom. Even if it does not limit what we can teach, it greatly affects the quality of education of the students who will enter our classroom. So I was thinking about Julie's final comment there, or some of her comments today about non-naive radical hope. What's really required, I think, for us to be better environmental historians, as part of environmental humanities, as part of environmental studies, as part of environmental communities, as part of global communities, is to get rid of our own fears and our own jealousies, to move beyond and to stop tinkering. And I say this as I'm getting closer to leaving, but to stop tinkering and radically change some things. How do we help to sustain our scholarship if we don't work to sustain the earth, both by advocating and tinkering, but moving beyond the tinkering, I guess. Anyway, thank you.
I love the precision of the historians, and I thank you very much for this, call to go back and think about contingencies and the what and who and when, and about connecting the dots in such a marvelous way that historians do, and sometimes also literature scholars do. And with this, thanking you for for what you shared with us, I would like to give the floor to Carmen Gallo. May I take the pleasure of reading the title of your new translation of The Wasteland? Okay, the title of the new translation of The Wasteland is La Terra Devastata, which of course is in itself a program and a project. So please take the mic and I speak.
Thank you, thank you. The building resist the name of the title, so that's good news. Okay, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you for the organizer for gathering us today around this challenging topic. There are a few words that we listened this moment today that I hope can resonate also in my paper, my contribution, even though it is a contribution, a literary scholar, not of an historian, but violence, the interconnection of crises, the visionary perspective that we heard before by Professor Tse, causality that we've been talking about just a minute ago, are all things that I hope I can take into consideration in my discourse. I thought a lot about the kind of contribution I could make to the discussion today, and I decided that maybe I could start from a few reflections that accompanied my Italian translation of The Wasteland. Reflections that affected my decision to change the title, to translate The Wasteland as La Terra Devastata, devastated land, instead of the traditional La Terra Desolata, the desolate land. I did not refer to an acrocritical approach in my edition. My intention at the beginning was to investigate the transhistorical thought in The Wasteland. So like privileging history over myth, So they'll say quite differently from the prevailing lines of interpretation of the wasteland, at least in Italy. And what came out from this attention to history in the wasteland was quite surprisingly a history of environmental devastations. And so I tried to draw a sort of map of these chronotopoi, of these wastelands, of the several wastelands which are involved in Eliot's poem and which have causes and responsibilities. And that's one of the key, these are one of the key concepts I'd like to talk about today. Wasteland has no direct equivalent in Italian, and that compelled me to investigate several aspects of Eliot's imagery and of wasteland, and what I would call their diachronic metamorphoses, because these wastelands present themselves both as historical landscapes, like the stage of the deadliest wars of the modern world or the polluted London, but also mythical spaces imbued with allegorical and anthropological values, as we all know. As for the keyword waste, we heard before one of the meanings of the words, it has undergone several semantic shifts and expansion since its first use in the 13th and 14th centuries. In English, medieval romances, as well as in the legends of the Fisher King collected by Jessie Weston in From Ritual to Romance, a wasteland is a barren land, one that is uncultivated and devoid of water due to an external cause, the king's illness or old age or weakness, which leaves the land exposed to abandonment or worse, to what Weston describes as the ravages of war. So what the legends of the Fisher King or Parsifal seem to suggest is that once upon a time, there was a rich land with lush vegetation that was destroyed and now is waiting, like the Sea King, for an opportunity to be healed. Actually, the two meanings, desolate and devastated, are both inscribed in the Latin word from which both waste and devastated derive, that is vastus. Vastus means huge, but also void, empty, but so that to waste means to destroy to the point of leaving an empty space, to the point to create a desert where once there was life. A perfect example, I think, of this interlacing of causes and effects is the city of Carthage, which is alluded to in a variety of ways in the wastelands. As you know, it was a Phoenician colony, and it was the greatest enemy of the Roman Empire because of its flourishing commercial activities in the Mediterranean. The conflicts of economic interest led the two sides to the Punic Wars, but according to a popular version, in particular of the Third Punic War, Carthage was defeated, was sacked and destroyed by the Romans, but most of all, the soil was scattered with salt, so that no vegetation or human activity could ever grow again. The land was reduced to an empty desert. But if we think of Carthage, as a desolate or barren land, we describe its present state while cancelling out the traces of its past, the traces of the violence inscribed in Carthage. that is historical, but also economic. The allusion to Carthage in the wasteland can be considered also a part of a wider Phoenician and economic plot, which include, you may remember, the veterans flowing over the London Bridge, which once they fought in Mile, so during the Punic Wars, and now they meet where? In the city, the financial district of London, and also the Phoenician sailor who died by water, but also forgot the profit and the loss. The profit and the loss of what? Of the economic treatises with Rome, the profit and the loss of a peace, the one that was established by the Romans, that was not a peace, but the complete destruction of Carthage. So, as you can see, there is somehow a reference to responsibility, and Carthage was a popular image, we can say, in 1919 during the Conference of Peace in Paris, because John Maynard Keynes wrote a little essay, a short essay, entitled The Economic Consequences of Peace, in which he talked about the Carthaginian peace, that was a negative expression that was used by Keynes to describe a peace whose aim was the complete destruction of the enemy. In this case was Germany in particular. A destruction that was to be completed not through fire or salt, as in the ancient time, but through unbearable debts, leading the population to misery. Like Keynes, Eliot, in his letters and everywhere in other documents, is worried about the future of Europe. He fears that new wastelands could appear in Europe after the war because of the disproportionate economic vexation. And he was quite prophetic about it, if you think about what happens in Germany before the Second World War. There's another wasteland that can be interesting to take into consideration, and is Ezekiel's wasteland. Do you remember where are the stony rubbish? That is a biblical landscape that is mentioned in the Burial of the Dead. If we read the whole biblical passage in which there's this description by Ezekiel, we find God threatening to reduce the land to a desert and to devastate Israel and its cities because, I quote from the King James Bible, all their abominations which they have committed. Once again, there is a responsibility. What are the abominations committed by men? Who broke the images heaped in line 22? Who's responsible for the landscape of the stony rubbish described in line 19? Stony rubbish, if you think about it, it perfectly melts together the allegorical and historical landscapes of the wasteland, the atemporal frame of the myth suggested by stones, and the modern environmental degradation of rubbish from which branches grow. I will not say more about the stony rubbish because Gabrielle McIntyre offered a beautiful eco-critical reading of these aspects of the poem. Let me just add about this aspect of degradation and about the pollution of London cityscapes. You may remember the winter brown fog, or the brown land, or the Thames full of rubbish, empty bottles, and sandwich paper. What I find interesting, at least for my discourse, is that Eliot is also mentioning Dickens in those lines. And this is probably a way to historicize the pollution he is describing. That pollution is not the present state of things, but comes from afar, from a logic of profit, from a kind of society that comes from the past. Time is running. So another wasteland I'd like to mention, I have no time to talk about it, is the city of Thebes that is mentioned by Tiresias. Here we do not have pollution, but we have contamination. In Greek tradition, as you know, unburied bodies contaminate the land, the soil, and the air, and lead those responsible to ruin, and most of all, the communities are led to pestilence. My suggestion is just that the millions of unburied bodies during the trench warfare was a way for Eliot to talk about a contamination of Europe and a moral plague in Europe. That is moral plague, I mean the moral bareness, spiritual dryness, and these kind of things. And he also talks about consumerism. So it also talks about a way of life that is contributing to pollution and to moral dryness. I'll get to my conclusion since I don't want to waste your time. What I find most interesting and what I think it can be useful for our discussion today, starting from T.S. Eliot Wasteland, is that the environmental threats in the wastelands are often pointing to the economic causes that are changing and devastating the European landscape and its moral horizon. If eco-criticism focuses on the forms of critical, literary, artistic, or cultural engagement with natural environments, what is most interesting is Eliot's attention to economic and historical causes that were and are changing and devastating the landscape and its moral, the modern landscape, and its moral, spiritual, or imaginative horizon. Unlike other kinds of an environmental representation, in Eliot's The Wasteland, we do not have romantic mythization of a natural past. We do not have aesthetic revaluation of an apocalyptic wasteland, sometimes eco-critical reading, like Apocalypse. And even worse, we do not have the fostering of an elitist utopia that envisions nature taking back control of the earth, as in some works about Anthropocene or post-human ideologies. Eliot, I think, suggests an ecological awareness of the deep interlacing of economic activity, environmental issues, the necessity to historicize the causes of the present state of things, and even a subtle denunciation of a way of life that is destroying human and natural ecosystems. At this point, we can maybe quote another meaning of waste that we can take into consideration, that is to spend or use carelessly, to squander, like when we waste the resources of a land or dissipate our talent. A wasteland is a land devastated by war, pollution, or profit, as Conrad Congo, that was quoted at the beginning by Eliot, but also a land in which imaginative and intellectual resources are wasted. I do think that environmental humanities and the attention to the environmental aspects of text can question habits of thought and help promote a radical rethinking of our relationship with nature, focusing on political and economic responsibilities as a crucial part of the discourse about global environmental exploitation and degradation. What we cannot do is cancel out the traces of history and its violence. Like Oedipus, we can ignore Eliot and others' prophecies about the real causes of the disaster that is threatening us. But in the end, this blindness could cost us the future of our planet. So, thank you.
Okay, so we can just continue the dialogue on the wasteland with Professor McIntyre.
Grazie molto, grazie al centro per l'invitazione e grazie per venire oggi. Thank you so much to everybody for being here. So first of all, I wanted to spend a little bit of time with the problem of the relationship between the animal and the human animal. It's a distinction which I think is one of the main drivers of our unsustainable exploitation of our ecospheres across the world. We tend to consider that our position as human is singularly unique within what I'm going to call for now the natural world for shorthand. And by that, I'm meaning our ecology and ecologies, our shared biospheres that extend across the planet, where we are all, and all, I don't mean just human, everything, species, microorganisms, etc. We are all synecdochic parts of this massive, vibrant collection of billions and billions of organisms that are intricately interdependent on a sublime scale that we cannot even grasp with all of our advanced science. Poetry and other forms of literature and storytelling, certainly including philosophy, history, politics, cultural studies, social studies, geography, and many more, may in fact be better at granting us momentary access to this sublime. And thus, I want to contend here, there are some very under-harnessed drivers of change and betterment, and it is our task as students and researchers within the humanities to begin to take on this sublime as part of our work. So the way in which we are singularly unique from other animals as human beings usually depends on insisting on our privileged position vis-a-vis logos, vis-a-vis logic, reason, language, and even the word that is linked with biblical, ancient Greek, and other religio-mythic accounts of the creation and substance of the world as something that was enunciated or spoken and that is associated and linked with a certain intellectuality. We are so privileged that we take our privilege for granted and we don't see it. We are blind to our positionality within our biosphere. Several modernist writers of the late 19th and early 20th century, including T.S. Eliot, but we could name many others. I think particularly of Virginia Woolf, W.B. Yeats, Rainer Maria Rilke, just as a few examples of people I have worked on. These writers have spent considerable focus on the tension that is perhaps dialectical, perhaps maybe more dialogical, between the human and the creaturely. As critic Eric Santner argues in his study on creaturely life, we both know ourselves to be distinct from animality and yet part of animality. We too are creaturely. So despite all of our evolution, our prefrontal cortex development, our advanced socialization within an evolving socius of the past roughly 10,000 years since we turned to agriculture after the last major ice age, and then the last roughly 5,500 years since we began writing. And I will add despite our combined immersion and isolation in ever more constructed human environments that will increasingly include not only skyrise dominated metropolises, but also immersive alternative realities. We retain, despite all of this, we as humans and as human animal retain instincts. We retain physiological and biological needs. We retain symbiotic and biotic necessities for the sun, for water, for nourishing food. We are dependent on cyclical seasonal rhythms that Eliot overtly addresses in The Wasteland, beginning with that famous opening, April is the cruelest month, that then moves very quickly to the winter that paradoxically, and because of human technology of modes of indoor heating, quote, kept us warm. So April is cruel, but winter kept us warm. And then Eliot moves quickly backward to the summer that surprised us, coming over the Starnberger Sea with a shower of rain. The simple fact that we consider the human to mean now in 2022, continually living in a state of exception as a state of normalized non-exception is part of the fundamental violence we do to our earth each day. Globally, we live, both as individuals and as collectives, in a protracted, now global state of a version of American exceptionalism, where the globally accepted dogma is one that values and valorizes continual extraction and use of so-called natural resources to breaking points and then beyond, to the point where such use becomes the ultimate in utilitarian abuse of our shared planet. And this orientation that I'm suggesting we all have of taking and having, let's say, transcends almost every other ideology, including capitalism, including modes of government, democratic or not. Well, it directs almost all human existence, with the exception of some eco-warriors, the exception of some indigenous groups, but it directs us to extract and to take endlessly. And we all go on each day, mostly doing nothing. Part of this blindness means a failure within the ethical realm to take accountability and responsibility for our destructive actions that endlessly pollute and scar and waste this earth. We fail to see daily that burning fossil fuels alone, and here I'm going to give you the rate at what we burn per day on our earth. We burn approximately 92 million barrels per day of fossil fuels. There are 42 gallons to a barrel. So just picture filling up an SUV about 92 million times every single day. This is taking us on a sure path of ecocide for our planet as we know it. It turns out that human-based domination and colonization of the natural is not sustainable. Okay, so I want to turn now to the hopeful part and to how can we work on a new radical poesis of change within the humanities in particular. I have 6 avenues of possible solutions. The first one is journalism. And this means bringing awareness, alerting us, covering climate change, reporting on, for example, nurdles. I don't know if anybody has heard of nurdles, but they're these tiny plastic pellets that are used in packaging and shipping. And there have recently been some major nurdle spills in the oceans that are extremely difficult to clean up. Bringing awareness of toxic waste and pollution, reporting on ice shelf collapses, reporting on rising sea levels, reporting on Greenpeace breakthroughs. The Guardian newspaper, for example, has for several years devoted some space pretty much every day to environmental issues. This is a big step. We need a lot more of it. The New York Times does not devote that kind of space to it. If anyone out here is a burgeoning journalist, please do this. Write about these issues, use your voice. Language and textuality here are allowing all of this to be reported and shared and to bring change. What else can we do? Okay, secondly, activism. And activism relies intrinsically on rhetoric, the word, language, and communication. I think of Greta Thunberg. She knows how to speak. She uses forceful, powerful rhetoric that tells it like it is. She's willing to speak truths, and I'm using her word, that are very uncomfortable to people to hear. And I'm also referencing here Al Gore's 2006 An Inconvenient Truth, which for some reason nobody seems to talk about anymore. But there's an ethics we're being demanded here that's being asked of us. And this is an ethics of truth telling, not evading, not denying, to use the language and the literary skills and the narrative skills that we have and that we're developing, and to try to use these to create active change. Just as a brief aside about Thunberg, I find it disturbing. She's quite often gendered and infantilized on both social media and in traditional media for being angry. There's a lot of energy and focus that goes into assessing where she is on the autistic spectrum, instead of on listening to what she's actually trying to say about our shared global crisis. The third avenue is just deep engagement. This means not numbing with technology or other addictions, not being distracted, as T.S. Eliot says, from distraction by distraction. This means fighting the very, very real psychic burden of the too muchness of the eco crisis, where people either, first of all, don't want to think about it, or secondly, think about it too much, and this gives an incapacitating anxiety. I have a recent Facebook post I want to quote to you. This is from a friend I respect, and I think this happens a lot, that people don't know what to do about the climate crisis vis-a-vis mental health. There's a new study on the effects of young people, roughly age 16 to 25, about the climate crisis. And a friend of mine posted about this new study and saying, you know, this is so difficult and awful. And most of the responses to her posting were versions of this. I can't think about this or read about this. And this is from all ages of people, who's young through much older. Quote, "My body just can't. And I suppose that is the problem, isn't it?" End quote. So we need to also, I think, get past generational blame games. We all need to do something to change this. We all need to think independently and collectively about how to make our lives different in everyday ways. Fourth Avenue is through education and pedagogy. So part of what we can do as learners, as teachers, instructors, is to help other people be awake. I think of Ralph Waldo Emerson, 19th century writer, philosopher, and he once said he had never yet met a man who was fully awake, and if he did, how could he bear to look at him? This falls right into line with the role of literary eco-criticism today. How do we wake up? How do we stop doing nothing or doing not enough? And then how do we bring this outside the academy, whatever we're seeing anew? And then number five, Fifth Avenue, the role of poetry. Poetry in particular, I would suggest, and many people have suggested this, has a capacity to take us to a beyond outside the everyday. It helps us ignite our imaginations. It helps us literally to imagine and to bring into potential other ways of existing on this planet. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare describes the role of the poet as one that verges on lunacy, but which has the power to transform our world. And fascinatingly, he describes the activity of the poet as one that moves across a broad eco-poetical scope, from heaven to earth, and then he chiasmatically reverses it from earth to heaven. And I'm just going to quote the beginning of Act 5, Scene 1. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Then, last point, number 6, I think very importantly, is just our task of surmounting unspeakability. So combating silence, this ties in with combating numbness, demanding of ourselves and of others that we don't remain silent, we don't remain acquiescent. Yes, our crisis is unfathomable, it's unspeakable, it's beyond language, it's a sublime of uniterability, COVID and climate change. And yet we must speak and continue to speak, and poetry, language can help get us there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So we move from point 2 of your 6 pointers, activism, to the history of activism, environmental activism in the United States. And I'm giving the mic to Angela Santese.
Thank you, Christina. I want also to thank the organizer for the invitation. Well, in the first contribution, Kathleen mentioned that actually the beginning of environmental history was also due as some sort of a response to the activism of the 60s and the 70s. And I want to go back to that period to try to underline the beginning, the genesis of modern environmentalism, to be understood as the social and political movement that was able to go beyond the issue of conserving resources and preserving wild nature that was instead at the center of the conservation movement that was mentioned before by Professor Nocera, because it was during the 70s that modern environmentalism rose not just in the United States, but around the world, leading to the emergence of global scale environmental anxieties on one side and global scale environmental awareness, and also to the birth of environmentalist campaign and movement. And although the mobilizing issue was different from place to place, generally speaking, we can say that environmentalism arose as a response, to quote J.R. McNeil, to the environmental disruption that came with pale economic growth in the so-called age of exuberance, which was the period after the Second World War. And in particular, the huge quantities of energy and materials that had fueled the post-war unprecedented economic growth, but also the wastes and pollution which were generated in the process, together, of course, with oil spills and accident at nuclear and chemical plants, basically combined to raise the public concern about the so-called negative externalities of economic growth. Highlighting at the same time the increasing decay and devastation of the environment. So from the 70s, environmental concern spread on a global scale, leading to the creation of environmental campaigns, which often were characterized by a not in my backyard approach and not in my backyard style of protest, and also to the development of environmental policies in both the United States and Europe. And also, although this campaign, this is the first point that I want to underline, had frequently a local connotation, contesting, for example, a single chemical or nuclear plant, they had at the same time a transnational dimension, a transnational connotation, because this latter element was related to the emerging awareness which was shared by protesters around the globe, that the world was integrated and really interdependent from the ecological point of view, and that issues such as, I don't know, population growth, energy consumption, industrial pollution could not be addressed as national problems. And coming to the United States, the genesis of the modern environmental movement is usually located in between the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962 and the celebration of the first Earth Day in 1970. And I want to spend some word on the role of Rachel Carson, because through her writing, Carson, which was a former biologist with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, made really an important contribution to the widening of environmental awareness of the impact of toxic substances and on not just on the humans, but also on the ecosystem. And Carson really played an important role in alerting Americans to the dangers of pesticide, which were mentioned before, finding her a niche as a communicator of scientific information on ecology to a wider public. And in 1951, she wrote this best-selling book, The Sea Around Us, which made a reputation. But Silent Spring is, however, the most famous of her works because also it sparked a considerable opposition from not just the pesticide industries, but also by the allies of the pesticide industries on the federal and state agricultural department. And why Silent Spring? Because Silent Spring was symptomatic of the central concern of the new environmentalism, because the book made a direct connection between amenity and health and raised an important set of questions that continue to define modern environmentalism, because human-generated pollution, of course, had changed over time from organic to synthesized contaminants that would not break down in an easy way. And on the contrary, they accumulated in the food chain, affecting humans. So with Kherson, human health became a major reason for supporting environmentalism. And Kherson was able to show Americans that they could maybe destroy themselves as well as destroy the environment around them. And Kherson might not have been so effective in her communication effort, and this is the other point I want to underline, if she had been unable to tap into the wider sense of community alarm that was spreading the nation at the time, and that was concerning atomic power. The danger of a nuclear war, as well as the reality of nuclear testing, raised public concern in the 60s, as did pesticide abuse, because both pesticide and nuclear waste implied a significant humanity growing impact on nature. And in fact, the same Kherson drew an analogy with nuclear fallout, arguing for some sort of parallel contamination of the environment. And above ground nuclear testing was already proving a danger in the 60s. Just to mention a couple of examples, after a test in Nevada in 1953, the fallout spread over the Northeast, and it was detected also in the area of New York. But maybe the most famous example was the accident of the Lucky Dragon, a small fish boat, which was actually reached by the fallout of a test of the Atomic Energy Commission, and basically the crew of the Japanese boat was killed by the radiation. And in this regard, it was really important the contribution of environmentalist Barry Commoner, which actually said that it was the Atomic Energy Commission that transformed him into an ecologist. And Commoner in 1956 provided the information, the nuclear fallout, to Adlai Stevenson for his presidential campaign. And he also initiated a petition to protest nuclear testing. And Kathleen, before mentioned St. Louis, Commoner formed the St. Louis Committee for Nuclear Information, which actually was able to prove that strontium-19, a chemical element which was derived from the nuclear fallout, to be present in the baby teeth. So this effort, which was made by scientists, but also by citizens and activists like Commoner, helped to produce the climate of opinion, which actually led to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. But the other really important component of this season of environmental mobilization was, of course, the one played by anti-nuclear power activities, which were really important for the further development of the environmental movement. For example, the crusade against the Diablo Canyon reactor in California was not successful, but the California anti-nuclear protest movement was paradigmatic of the shift that, as Thomas Wellock underlined, and this is a quotation, allowed the environmental movement to transcend traditional wilderness advocacy and draw on a broader popular coalition, which actually included consumer, student, and other social protest movement. And not by chance, anti-nuclear activists such commoner became concerned in the 70s with a wider issue of pollution and with the wasteful use of energy characterized by the high consumption US economy. And of course, such individual activists could not have been effective without the mobilization of larger number of people in environmental organization. And this really my last point. And it's relevant that two of the most important, if not the most important organization that were born in this period were linked to the Sierra Club, the conservation group born in 1892. The first one is Friends of the Earth, which was created in 1969 by David Brower after his resignation as executive director of the Sierra Club. And the second was Greenpeace, which actually was created by a group of activists of the Sierra Club chapter of the area of Vancouver in Canada. And so to conclude, the period between the 60s and the 70s was really a turning point, a shift in the environmentalist movement, because it implied the passage from a focus on wilderness protection to a wider interest on urban and industrial problem, human health, and generally speaking on the negative externalities of human activities on the natural system. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you to all the speakers for these really stimulating observations that they have shared with us. And I'm sure that the floor will participate with questions so that we can start the debate. I would like to point out, or maybe just to break the silence at the beginning, to point out to two things that I think are very important in what all the speakers shared with us, but also our previous speaker, Professor Z, discussed earlier. One thing is Professor Z mentioned the structure of feelings from Raymond Williams, and I think somebody else talked about a whole way of life, which is another terms, another expression by Raymond Williams, the whole way of life of a population, which for him was the definition of culture. And I think all the observations, the interventions today were really focusing on those whole ways of life of populations, connecting the what's and the who, and consumerism, the structure of history, the deep structure of history, and the horizontal networking and expansion of the connections. And two, which is connected to what I've just said, the idea of whatever you do, whether you're doing history or whether you're studying literature or whether you are a social scientist, you need to connect the dots. That without connecting the dots, we don't gain any picture that enables us to make statements, to become empowered activists, to call back our previous histories and to rewrite histories. Because history is nothing if not revisionist, right? Maybe the historians disagree with me on this, but I think these are aspects that always situate us as players in this field. And the third element is, somebody mentioned, interdisciplinarity. Actually, integration, somebody else said, it's not just interdisciplinarity, but it's integration. We need to bring knowledge, to integrate knowledges so that we can make, we can produce other stories. With this really rich series of interventions and comments, I would like to invite the floor to, raise their issues and questions and observations to our speakers. Yes. We have a question in the third row.
Actually, it's not a question, maybe more a reflection about because I remember, I think in a game of chess, Eliot said something about the fragmentation of the past. And now we are talking about the fact that we cannot think about ourselves and our action as isolated. So just we're not islands, and we are not we are part of a of something that is entire, and every action has a consequence. So I think that maybe we cannot divide. We have to learn from the past, and even if, and to me it's strange that that activism started in the 70s, let's say late 60s, and now we are in 2022 when we are still fighting for climate changes. I mean, I always think that humans are capable of doing incredible things. Why we are not capable of improving our lives in a better way, and just thinking about the economic aspect.
Thank you. Can I just follow up on that? I thought that was a beautiful comment. I think your point about the fragmentation of the past, that we can't think of ourselves as isolated individuals. Not only can't we think of ourselves as isolated, I think we have to interrogate ourselves. And a number of people spoke to that today, about our roles as consumers, perhaps most significantly, but as part of these institutions. All of us in different ways are part of these institutions. Institutions that determine who gets to participate, who gets to protest, what rules are in play, what kinds of evidence can even be presented to challenge things. So we're talking about structures of feeling, which I think are very important. But as a former lawyer, good luck putting that into evidence. So we have to recognize our own participation in these institutions. And Julie's phrase today was not just tinker. We have to be willing to radically change the institutions in which we work, which is a little scary, because while we don't want economics to drive everything, it's good to have a job. It's good to be employed. So, but thank you. I think that was a perfect comment.
Maybe I'll just say one little thing to speak to that as well. Thank you for that comment. So first, you did make me think of T.S. Eliot's moment in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which is from 1917. just over 100 years ago, where he talks about the past. And people focus on this word tradition with him, and it becomes a bad word. But a lot of the time, he's talking about the past. He's talking about memory, history, and I think he's also talking about not just human history and cultural history, but also natural histories. And in that essay, Eliot says that the past is still living and still vital. And part of our task in the present is to recognize our connection to the vitality of the past and to the fact that like nothing's actually dead. Yes, bodies have died and things have decomposed, but in terms of ideas, again, like Professor Brosnan was saying, we have the opportunity going forward at every moment to recreate what's going to happen next and to recreate the next history or the next historical moment. And I think part of what we need to do is almost crack the code, figure out there's so much collective goodwill, and yet we all remain enslaved to this system of domination and consumption. So, how do we crack that?
Thank you for sharing with us your thoughts about what we were talking about. What came to my mind when you were saying like, activism was born in the 70s and we are still fighting. What came to my mind is that the enemy is really smart. So, we have to change strategies and invent new strategies all the time. It doesn't mean that those strategies were not successful, just that the enemy continues to change his position. And you also said, learn from the past. And we were talking now also, Gabrielle, we're talking about tradition and past. I think what we should learn from the past that has some positive and negative things in it is complexity. I really appreciated Professor Brosnan's talking about complexity, because it has a lot to do with connecting the dots that also Professor Yuli was talking about. Complexity is an important thing. During totalitarianism, the first things that is usually done is to simplify language. Simplify language to simplify ideas, so you can manipulate minds, ideas through language. What is important to do with our past, with the burden of our past, is to preserve its complexities. And it is a form of privilege that we have. To recognize it as a privilege, to have the possibility to stay here today to talk about our past and not about what we will eat tonight, for example, is a kind of privilege. And what I just wanted to add is that complexity seems to me a key word about our relationship with past.
Thank you for your suggestion. Actually, not just the first movement were born in the 70s and in the 60s, but also the first regulation at the federal level were already in place at the end of the 60s. And this made me think to what was just underlined, Carmen, that the problem is also connected to the technological evolution of the industrial system. So the regulation are not always enough to deal, to stay at pace with the changing in the industrial system. And yes, so we have to take into consideration not only the side of the mobilization, but also the role played by the industrial system in furthering the cause before the federal and state administration.
Thank you very much for the very, very interesting and full of insights presentations. Actually, even mine, it's a consideration more than a question. Also, maybe because we don't have many answers. That's also something that I believe, in a sense. It's such an important topic, and that affects all of us. And the same fact that we don't have the answers, maybe it's a sign of its importance. Well, thinking of what happened in the last years about COVID-19, but also what's happening in the rest of the world right now, I think that one of the biggest issues, thinking of what Dr. McIntyre highlighted, is as the 6 solutions, let's say, could also be the fact that there is a major problem of distance. What I felt in these years is that the most let's say the closest is something, the more we become aware. But as soon as we overcome it, we forget about it, in a sense. So I believe that environmental crisis, it's a major concern that has to deal with this idea that as humans we have of the distance. And I think about, for instance, war. War has become a core theme in all university courses, all schools, because it has been something that marked our history. So why don't we do the same with environment? In a sense, I see also among my peers that we believe that it's something that will happen maybe one day, but we're not so sure. And in any case, they're very distant, and we can produce more. We have science, we have technology that can help us. But actually, it's important that somehow we start addressing this idea of preventive and preemptive action, as we all do, but the sense is always that we are good saying it out loud, but not so much in engaging. So there is this constant struggle between the necessity to always demonstrate that science and technology has brought us further, but at the same time also the constant struggle with the reality, which is also something like COVID-19 and global warming and everything. So yeah, thank you very much.
Is it all right if I speak to that? Okay. Thank you. That's such an interesting set of problems that you're addressing. Just this issue of isolation and distance that's been exacerbated by COVID-19 across the world. One thing that comes to mind as you're saying that is apparently this is a psychological truth that if there's any kind of accident, so let's, somebody falls and breaks their leg on the street, the more people that are around, the less percentage of people will get active in helping. If there's only 1 or 2 people around, they will help. But if there are 100 people, probably everyone will walk by and assume somebody else will do it. So I think part of what we have to do now is change. It's incredibly hard. We've got to rewire our psychology. We actually have to seriously start thinking more about being completely accountable as each unto each, as each person to each other person, as each person to every snail, lion, polar bear, beetle, bumblebee out in the planet. And part of the big problem, if there's going to be a new psychology and a new ethics and a new mode of empathy, is that we are being dragged in the opposite direction by social media. So it's a huge pull on that effort of empathy because, I mean, well, so many reasons, but one is we have a barrage of information, but we also have it by ourselves most of the time. You know, we read these posts and we consume incredible amounts of information about each other, but we do a lot of that by ourselves in the name of communicating. So how do we get to a place where we're, you know, radically increasing empathy with every being, every ontological being on the planet, while we're also being kind of held back and held down? And then, I mean, I mentioned briefly, you know, immersive reality. That's going to be another massive, massive change that's literally on the cusp of happening in the next 5 years. I think it's less than 5 years. Scientists are saying that the immersive realities will be so real that we won't be able to tell the difference between what's real here and what's real in the virtual reality.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful comment. When you mentioned distance, I started quickly scribbling notes. We tend to think of distance as spatial. But of course, as a historian, I would also think we have temporal distance. We struggle to maybe have empathy with people in the past, but there are all kinds of difference: cultural distances, economic distances, species-based distances. And what you're saying, you're thinking the same thing I was thinking. I wrote down the diminishments of our cultural structures, our community structures. So while social media is supposed to be so profoundly good at building communities, are these virtual communities going to have the same impacts in terms of shaping policy, but also in terms of shaping how we view each other in our communities? For example, I think I would argue one of the biggest things that has led to the political divisions in the United States more recently, and maybe in other places as well, is the loss of the hometown newspapers. It didn't necessarily have to be grappling with the major political issues that the nation faced, but there was some consistent stories that were shared among people in your neighborhoods. And all of that has gone away with the loss of the local newspapers. My hometown newspaper, which is usually 4 pages a day, and is so often just blurbs from the Associated Press, badly edited, so it's incredibly difficult to follow them. So there are so many things working against our ability to have community. And I do think empathy grows out of community. It's such a big part of that. So thank you. I think that was a really important comment.
Right, GM. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. I also have a question for Professor McIntyre. In your essay, "The Wasteland as an eco-critic," you point out that the poem's main topic is death and life, because the dead literally populate and contaminate the wasteland, right? Well, at the same time, I'm thinking of a very famous work recent, actually, by Richard Powers, The Overstory, who kind of talks about a reversal of the death and life rhetoric, because he talks about life and death. He talks about the trees, but he also brings up the, and I'm quoting, the fecund putrefaction of rotting trees. Looking at all this glorious decay, a person might be forgiven for thinking that old men decadent. So what I would like to ask you is, do you think that going towards this reversal of the death and life symbolism, rhetoric, might be the way to go in terms of literary studies? Or do you think is that still too bleak of a pose to pursue? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful, wonderful comment and observation. Just to let other people know, that quotation about the wasteland, so Eliot himself said the wasteland was about death in life. That's according to his friend, John Davy Hayward, with whom he lived for many, many years as just a friend, ostensibly. And I think it's so interesting that you want to chiasmatically reverse it, because I always have trouble remembering what the order is. And in the wasteland, I feel you can read it both ways. And tomorrow I think it's either in tomorrow or the next day, one of the papers I'm giving, I'm going to be talking specifically about the growth from the dead in the burial of the dead, and the way human bodies and bones are asked to flower within T.S. Eliot's poetry, and specifically in The Wasteland. But then also this question of finding life in death. Yes, absolutely. I think that would be a nice way to imagine a future for literary studies, for eco-poetics. There is so much life, there's so much vibrancy. There's an incredible future ahead for all of us. And I think we need to be hopeful and be optimistic, and not fall into the despair that can be so disabling, but at the same time feel the despair. You know what I mean? I mean, we can't say, oh, well, nothing bad is happening, we're all going to be Pollyannish and feel okay and fix this. There's something about going through this collective trauma, which we're slowly recognizing, this damage we're doing to the planet, that it is absolutely about, as Professor Tsi was saying, about death and dying and leaving old ways behind. But it's also about a burgeoning and hopefully finding new energies and new ways to be. So I'll stop there, but there's lots more to say on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I wanted to, I can't remember the name of the book now, but it's a collection of essays by Greg Mittman and others. And it essentially is taking things that we think of as artifacts and telling their histories. And so when I teach my US environmental history class, one of the assignments I give to my students is to take something that's part of their daily life, to imagine it's buried for 200 years, and then tell us what history somebody's going to write about that object when they find it in 200 years. What will that object say about our culture, about you as the user, about how we valued the earth or how we valued each other? And they could write about this. They could write about these chairs, which are a direct result of developments in the petrochemical company industries that was mentioned before. But it is a way to try to get us to begin to think about our choices as consumers and the way in which we all can participate in making these changes, even if we are not the activist standing with the Dakota pipeline protesters, which I will talk about tomorrow. That there are ways in which we can participate through small steps. And so, we all try to convey that to our students if we can.
First of all, thank you all for your speeches. They were really fascinating and gave a lot of food for thought. And I have both a comment and a question. Can you hear me? Yeah, I was thinking about what Professor McIntyre said about T.S. Eliot's tradition and individual talent, and this idea of the influence of the past on the present that keep coming up. And it reminded me of Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, where she says that it's important to staying with the trouble for her means being truly present, but doesn't mean erasing the past. And that this can be full of inheritances. And so it's really about working with what we have, with the troubling legacies of the past and building something new. So I think, yeah, I just made that connection. And I also had a question because I was thinking about Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. And her text was filled with apocalyptic language. And for that time, it really resonated with and it gave impulse to the environmental movement. It really raised consciences. And at the same time, I know that in the environmental humanities now, there is a lot of debate about the usefulness of apocalyptic rhetoric and language, both in literature and media. And I was wondering what your opinion is about that, because if on one hand, I think it can respond to the sense of denial and distraction, also caused by the media. But at the same time, I also feel like consumer capitalism seems to subsume everything under its wing, and that apocalypticism has almost become entertainment. So I was just wondering, what's your position on that?
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's true for the book of Rachel Carson, but it's true also for other, I would say, feature for other instrument that were actually used by other movement. What came to my mind now is, for example, this terrible movie, which was produced in 1983 and which was called The Day After, which was about the consequences of a nuclear all-out exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. And also there, the language, the images were really apocalyptic. There was no hope in the Day After, but nonetheless, the movies was effective in producing a further mobilization, a further preoccupation inside the US public opinion. So I don't know about the current debate about now, but then was kind of effective. The same was for another, yes, for this was a book which was called, the book of Jonathan Shell, I can remember the Fate of the Art, which was as well full of catastrophic images and was popular as well.
Something about what you were saying about the capitalism that seems to subsume everything. Yeah, that's right, but that could be also an idea of the capitalism to convince us of that. So, you know, you never get out of it if you don't want to. So despair is disabling, as Gabrielle was saying before. And something I wanted to add, this is about creating community. I live in Naples, and I feel sometimes that there are places or just lucky experiences in which I have the feeling that creating communities is easier. During the pandemics, I had the possibility to make a lot of things. I don't want to talk about it, but I almost felt the community of my neighborhood more during the pandemics that now that we don't even say hi in the streets. while there was a moment, and there are some realities which were born during that time that are still surviving and are still important. Just to say that somehow we should not universalize too much our experience, and also to remember that also in what appears to us as homogenic fabric, there can be spots that we can go looking for them and join them somehow. Yeah, maybe that was what I wanted to say. Yeah. Thank you, sorry.
So you mentioned this idea of apocalypse becoming a spectacle, becoming entertainment. And I think that, that's a very real thing. And I wonder, where does that come from? Why do we have this human capacity to witness, but then fail to witness destruction that we're causing? One term I'm going to be using tomorrow is méconnaissance. So from Jacques Lacan, this misknowing. And I also think there's a drive, and this goes back to Freud. Freud talks about the dyad of the life drive and the death drive. And somewhere in Freud, or at least post-Freud, there's this notion that both of these, the life drive and the death drive, are linked with fundamental narcissism. And our fundamental narcissism at one level is healthy, right? We need it to exist, to have an ego, to have an identity. But it gets out of hand when we get to the point that there's so little that we can use to make sense of ourselves other than, say, destruction and the death drive. So to me, I think people who are using devastation and even apocalypse as a form of, let's make a movie out of that. Let's pay money, let's be stimulated, and then go home and never think about it ever again. Or do video games about it or whatever, but not actually take any action. That to me seems like the death drive is having a very unbalanced effect within a lot of psyches, and this is happening everywhere. I don't even want to start to make the connections between the rise in gun violence, things like that. But we have this ability as a species, and this is part of our logos, to almost be sarcastic about our own destruction, to see it as a spectacle, to recognize metacritically we're in the postmodern, we're watching ourselves evolve in this destructive element. And okay, what are we going to do? We're going to play video games about it.
That our time's up. So let me thank our speakers for their wonderful, suggestive, compelling talks. And I think we couldn't desire to use a word that Elliot, I think, cherished for a better opening of our seminar. And thank you, Christina, for chairing. Thank you for your questions. And let me remind you that you have to sign, because I've been told that maybe not all of you have signed. And so please remember to do that for each session. And we're going to meet again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay. So that's everything for today. Thank you again.